Now we need to actually select the number when we press on it. To select a number, we just need to add its index right here in the selected numbers array that belongs to the state of the game component, which means the game component should have a function that does exactly that. So let's call this function select number, and it is an arrow function that will modify the state. And to select a number, just like is number selected, I need access to the number index to be selected. Again, I can't just select based on the number value. I need the number index. So this function is basically going to set the state. So it will return an object that has the new state. And inside this object, we are going to change the selected numbers array and basically push a new element to that selected numbers array. So I have options here. I can, for example, do something like selected numbers and do the previous selected numbers and then concat the new number to it. However, I prefer to use the object spread property. So basically, I'd like to copy the original previous state dot selected numbers. So this will copy the original array, and then we just add the number index. Of course, the order doesn't really matter as long as the number index is inside the selected numbers. So every time we select a number, we want to copy the existing selected numbers and then append this new number index to the same array and return that. And of course, we do this to stay immutable, right? We don't want to mutate the state directly. We want to return a new object to be merged with the state. So we can simplify this set state and use parentheses instead of the other syntax. Let me format that. So this way it is returning the object directly using the arrow function shorthand notation, and I don't need the return keyword. And of course, since we are depending on the previous state, it's much safer to use the contract that receives the function rather than the contract that receives an object. Okay, so now that we have a select number function, we need the random number component to invoke this function when we press on it, right? So I need to flow this new behavior to the random number component, just like I flow data to the random number component. Now, you might be tempted to use the same name. Say something like select number equal this dot select number. This will work. However, from the perspective of the random number component, it shouldn't really know that the press event is selecting a number in the game component, because I might actually use the same random number component in a different game that does not select a number, does something else when you press on it. So from the perspective of the random number component, we should just name this onPress. What should you do when I press on you? As the random number component, it's a lot safer to not know what is going on. This is a little bit more about isolating the responsibilities of every component. In fact, this is selected property is also revealing the logic of the game that a number is selected. So maybe instead of is selected, we do something like is disabled, right? Because if it is selected in here, if this function is returning true and the number is selected, the random number should just be disabled. It should look disabled and it should behave disabled. So let's actually change that. Instead of is selected everywhere here, I'm going to use is disabled. And instead of selected style, we'll name that as disabled. I like this much better than the first version. Naming is actually hard, and it does matter. You might think that it doesn't matter here, but it does, because now this component doesn't have any logic, even in names, about the state of being selected or that a number is going to be selected when it's pressed. So it's totally generic even in names. And I might actually make it more generic. So instead of naming it random number, it would be something like pressable number or something like this. But I think the name random number is okay in our case, just to have things related to the randomness of the game in general. Okay, so now that we have an onPress function that we pass down to the random number component, we can now use it. So first we define a prop type for this onPress. onPress is prop types.function, which is the property func for prop type, and it's also required. What should I do when I press the component? So when I press on this component, I need to call this new props, which is onPress. So basically, instead of console log here, we need to call this dot props dot onPress, And we want to pass the index of the component here. Remember how onPress expects the index of the number that we are executing. However, we are not passing the index of the number to the random number component. We're only doing it as a key, and we can't actually access the key as a prob inside the random number component. So let's also pass the index. And instead of calling it an index, I'm going to call it ID. So the ID of this random number is its positional index. It's the same thing as key, but now I have this props.id inside the random number that would represent this index. So we need to define this ID. So ID is prop types dot number that is required. And now I am going to pass in here this props ID, which is the unique identifier for this number, and it's basically the position. Now, the reason I named it ID instead of just using index is because I might later change the design and actually have an actual ID for every number instead of this positional index. So from the perspective of the random number component, it receives an ID, an identifier. It doesn't receive an index. So I think this will work. Let's actually test. Let's select this one, selected, 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 selected. Perfect.